So I got the chance to go on Jubilee and debate the one and only Alex O'Connor. Now, as the kids like to say,
I ain't gonna lie, I'm getting cooked.
and I'm not ashamed to admit that. I went out there, I did my best, and I fumbled the ball. Now, there are many reasons for that, and some of them I can't get into, but ultimately, the topic I went up for wasn't actually the topic I wanted to talk about. There were two topics I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about the Christology, I wanted to talk about Jesus being God, and I wanted to talk about genocide in the Bible, but unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, I did not get the chance to go up and do that. So out of a fear of wasting thousands of dollars and traveling all the way to Los Angeles, I went up for a topic I was comfortable in, but not really prepared to go toe to toe with Alex in, considering I didn't have any notes and I didn't generally know the topic we were going to be talking about beforehand, so I didn't really have time to prep for it. So I went up there, I did my best. Some things I think I did correctly, some things I did poorly, and this is what this video is intended to do, is to correct those things that I did poorly. So there's one point you kind of keep going back to is the opening of the graves. And you're saying we're not seeing that anywhere in history. And I kind of agree with what Than was saying, is this is an argument of silence. So we don't see anywhere in history the destruction of Pompeii being written down through Vesuvius. This is a huge event.
Sure.
Why don't we see that?
If we had accounts describing Pompeii around the time that happened and they just didn't mention it, you don't think that would be a bit suspect?
Well, we don't see anything talking about the destruction of Pompeii.
Sure, but if we had accounts that were written about Pompeii at the time of the destruction and they didn't mention it, do you think that would be weird?
So one of the things I think I did correct was bringing up Vesuvius, because I do think that brings up a big problem with Alex's argument of silence, which I still think he's bringing up that type of argument when he brings up the graves in the Gospel of Matthew. It is an argument of silence. Now, one of the things I've noticed in the comment section of the Jubilee video is all the people telling me, Pliny the Younger talked about Vesuvius, John, you're an idiot, except for the fact that he didn't. So let's go through all the facts, some of the things that both me and Alex missed. So first of all, the Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD. Pliny wrote 2 letters to Tacitus in 107 to 108 AD about the destruction of Pompeii, so to speak. Except in both those letters, he never mentions Pompeii. He mentions the eruption of the Vesuvius. He mentions some destructions of towns. He mentions a lot of things, but he never specifically mentions Pompeii. In his first letter, as you can see in the quote here, it talks about the destruction of so many populous cities, talks about a cloud coming out of a mountain, which he describes it looking kind of like a tree. He talks about how Recentia, I think I'm saying that right, felt like she was in danger because of the Vesuvius, and how she felt she had no way to escape except by sea. He talks about the flames that came out of the mountain. He talks about the darkness that filled the sky, and then they talk about the burning villages. In the second letter, he talks about a dreadful cloud, broken with rapid zigzag flashes, masses of flames, sheet of lightning. He talks about how that cloud descends upon the sea, and it could seal the island of Capri. He talks about how a dark mist spread over the whole country. Then he talks about how one part of Misenum had fallen, and how another part of it was on fire. And then he later talks about returning to Misenum, but the earthquake still continued. So an entire town of Pompeii is completely destroyed, yet he never mentions that specifically. This is a huge event that is recorded. He did record the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. He did record the destruction of cities. He recorded people's interactions with the eruption, but he never mentions the destruction of Pompeii. So Alex brings up that specific contention is, if you were to see writings from this time period about Pompeii or about the destruction, would you not expect to see those writings? And I concede, well, yeah, it'd be weird if we didn't, except we do see writings about the eruption, but we don't see writings about a destruction of a complete town. The only mentions that we can seem to find about Pompeii during this time period, from my research at least, seems to be some graffiti. Now, I may be wrong about that, but that's all I can find. And I'm not sure if I'm going to say the name right, but Seneca the Younger talks about Pompeii having an earthquake in roughly about 62 to 64 AD. This would be about 10 to 15 years before the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. So we do see in history people writing about tragedies that did fall upon Pompeii, but for some reason, the entire city being destroyed gets left out. If we didn't find the city in itself, I would argue that some people would say Pompeii never existed. But because we have the archaeological evidence of Pompeii, we can't deny this. So once again, the only thing Alex is doing here is an argument from silence. He's saying we don't see it anywhere else, so therefore it didn't happen. Well, we don't see any writing about the destruction of Pompeii, but he doesn't conclude that that didn't happen. As a matter of fact, it's not about until 211 to 233 AD that we see Pompeii being talked about in the way that it was destroyed by Cassius Dio, where he talks about 2 cities being fully buried. buried, which is Herculaneum and Pompeii.
I think that's one hypothesis. But I think when we're looking at the Gospels, we have another hypothesis. We have this fact that, we mentioned the undesigned coincidences. You're familiar with that, right? We have the fact that they go through a lot of historical information, so they get geography right. You agree with this?
Yeah, yeah.
So would you say that we have authors that are located within this area during this time period?
I don't know if I can say that with confidence. And I think it depends on which gospel you're talking about.
Well, let's just go like the Synoptics.
The Synoptics. So who do you think is the author of, say, the Gospel of Mark?
I would say it's Mark.
That was John Mark, the author of...
Yeah.
Now, why do you think that?
Well, I think you're just kind of brushing off my question, though. Do you think the authors were in that time period during that, in the location?
I think even if that's the case, I think that the events were written down decades after they happened.
Okay, but we are saying...
But I'm happy to... Let's say that I granted it. Okay, so these accounts are at least based on eyewitness testimony. Fine. So what?
So as I mentioned before in my video with Exploring Reality and Doxastic Mastery, as well as when I was live with Inspiring Philosophy, I was kind of taken back when Alex brought this up because he says their eyewitness testimony. So what? I wasn't really sure how to respond in that moment. Because if we could put the authors in the time and place, it raises the probability of it being true rather than a myth. And from my understanding, Alex believes that this is a developing myth that happened over time. But if the authors were alive during this time period and were attempting to record accurate information, it would lower the probability that this is a developing myth. And I wanted to get him to talk about these things, but he was really good at directing me towards contradictions. For example, I wanted to talk about Archelaus in the Gospel of Matthew. I know Alex likes to bring up the fleeing to Egypt being a contradiction between the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. Except for in the Gospel of Matthew, there's a bit of a throwaway line that brings up this person called Archelaus. Now, Archelaus was somebody who was reigning at this very specific time. He's only reigning for a very short period and he was never actually made king. Now, during this time, him and the Jews during Passover got into a little of a headbutting contest, which ended up with Archelaus killing a whole bunch of Jews. Now, it says in the Gospel of Matthew that Joseph was afraid to return to Judea because of Archelaus. And that makes absolutely no sense until we look at what's recorded with Josephus, where he talks about, this headbutting contest happening. Now, for the sake of time, we're not going to go into all of this right now, but I did want to talk to Alex about this. How did they get this very small thing correct if this is supposed to be an invented narrative? This would show us that Matthew is attempting to record real information, or bare minimum, he lived there and knew exactly what was going on, and then somehow invented a story, but then just threw in little tidbits of truth in there that wasn't really expanded on. It just doesn't seem likely to me. And that's one thing I wanted to talk about. Basically, how did they get such a small thing correct if he's inventing a fake story to impose his theology? And then, of course, this would also point to the fact that this is just another argument of silence, as my friend Than brought up correctly in his conversation with him.
And why does that true information often contradict itself?
In what way does it contradict itself?
What's the date of Jesus' death? The Synoptics say that it was on the Passover. John has it before the Passover.
So there's a long, convoluted answer to that. It's how they use idioms in the language. I don't want to get into that right now.
So full on, I was mistaken with calling this an idiom. For some reason, my brain thought he was talking about the 3 days and 3 nights contradiction that's in the Bible, but I know he was talking about the resurrection. I was in the moment, my adrenaline was going, and I just didn't really get what he was saying, and so I was answering the question improperly. But of course, hindsight is 2020. I know Alex is talking about the death and not the resurrection, so that was my mistake. So let's get into that. Is the death of Jesus a contradiction? Does it get it wrong? So for those that don't know, this appears to be a contradiction because the Synoptics say Jesus was arrested during the Passover meal, which is a Thursday. John seems to contradict this because he is arrested, but then the next morning in John 18:28, the Jews say they don't want to defile themselves because it's Passover, which we can also see confirmed in John 19:40. Now this means in John, Jesus was arrested the night before Passover, but in the Synoptics, the night of Passover. Now, there are some things to remember here. First, John uses the word Passover to refer to Passover week, not just the night of the Passover meal. We could see John using it this way in John 2:13, John 6:4, and John 11:55. So what night does John actually say Jesus got arrested? Was it the night before Passover or the night of Passover? Well, in John 13:29, it says that they thought Judas was going to get food for the Passover meal, which seems to me would have been the Thursday, the night of the Passover meal, because food would most likely start to perish if he bought it the night before. Plus, it says some thought he was going to give alms, which was a common practice that was specifically done during the night of the Passover meal. People would go to give alms, and they even left the temple open longer so the poor could gather and collect the alms that would be given out to them. So on the surface, it does seem like John is talking about this event happening during the Passover meal during Thursday. But if this is the case, why didn't the Jews want to be defiled for Passover if it was Friday and not Thursday? Because remember, they took them for trial the next morning. Well, if they were worried about being unclean on Thursday for Passover and not Friday, this wouldn't make any sense, because according to Leviticus 15:5-11, they would only remain unclean until the evening. So they didn't have to be worried about being made unclean, because come sunset, they would have been made clean again and would have no problem participating in the Passover meal. But there was a Friday midday Passover meal called the Haggakah. If they would have defiled themselves then, they would have made themselves unclean for the Haggakah. And this is most likely what they didn't want to be defiled for. Now in John 19:14, it says it was the day of preparation for the Passover. On the surface, this would seem to be going against my argument. But once again, John uses Passover to talk about the week, not just the day. So when he's talking about this, he's most likely talking about the preparation for the Sabbath, which is not uncommon language, because we could see it in Matthew 27:26, Mark 15:72, Luke 23:54, and the Didache 8:1. They all refer to Friday as the day of preparation. John 19:31 and John 19:44 called it the day of preparation, which means it was a Friday. So this means there is no contradiction between John and the Synoptics. They are both saying that Jesus was arrested on a Thursday and crucified on a Friday.
What
right
time
now?
did Jesus die?
So I don't want to
Mark
get in.
says that it's 9 in the morning. John explicitly tells us that he's still standing before Pilate at midday.
So this one is actually a relatively simple answer. They did not keep time like we kept time. If you look through Acts, for example, you can see time is often referred to as the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hour. In other works, we can also see the addition of the 12th hour. They very rarely gave time periods between those. They didn't have watches. They didn't keep time like we kept time. So when they're talking about the 3rd, 6th, 9th, and 12th hour, these are vague references to certain points in the day. Time was referenced back then in quarters, not like how we do with hours and minutes. Now, there is some discussion on what the 6th hour actually is. Now, some scholars say noon, and on the surface, this seems obvious, but there are scholars like J.B. Burry that says this is probably around 11 a.m. So when Mark is saying the 3rd hour, he's saying any time between 9 a.m. and noon. And John's saying the 6th hour would mean sometime before midday. So if Jesus was crucified at 11 a.m., for example, they would both be correct. They would still even both be correct if it was like around 10 a.m. Because again, these times weren't meant to be hyper-specific. They were meant to be vague references to certain points in the day.
When Jesus is on the cross, there are two thieves next to him, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do they say?
One says, one condemns him, and one says, don't condemn him.
That's what happens in the Gospel of Luke. In the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew, which are earlier, both of them mock him on the cross.
Yeah, I don't see that being an issue.
You don't see that as being an issue.
Why would that be an issue?
Because this is quite an important theological point that's being made. Jesus is forgiving his enemies right before his death. This seems to me, if the earlier Gospels, Mark and Matthew, say that this didn't happen, and explicitly says that the people who were on the cross next to him were mocking him, this is a story that Luke has invented.
But
why would Luke invent a story like that to make a theological point, which tells us that the Gospel writers are willing to invent things in order to make a theological point?
I think you're just assuming an invention.
Pause.
So I wish I had more time here, because I feel like I was finally getting into my rhythm, but then we got voted out, but it happens. So Alex is just assuming a lot here. He's assuming there's an invention of a story to convey a certain theological meaning. But for example, if I could have shown earlier that the Gospels are trying to record accurate information from that time, and that they were actually giving us a lot of truth claims, then we could ask the question, what is more likely? We could give the hypothesis that they are inventing certain ideas for theological reasons. We could also say that some of the authors are just trying to record the gist of what happened, while others are trying to be more precise. We could also just say some of the authors made a mistake, and they weren't aware that one of the thieves said one thing and one of the thieves said another thing. Instead, they just made the mistake and thought both of them said the same thing. We can also give the hypothesis that they both did mock Jesus, but then one had a change of heart and then said, hey, maybe this isn't something that we should do. Ultimately, we don't have enough data to say that we know exactly why it's being recorded the way it's being recorded. But Alex does not just get to insert his hypothesis as it's a fact. because of an argument of silence. In short, guys, hindsight is 2020. These are some of the things that I wish I could have said, if I was a little bit more prepared, if I wasn't so nervous. There's a lot of things that we can incorporate, but if we could go back and do it again, these are some of the things I wish I could have said in the moment. Overall, it was a great experience. I think Alex was a great guy. I was super blessed to have a conversation with him. I would love to go back and do one of these things again. And like I said before, we spent some time talking about this video with my friends Than and Tim. You can find a link down below if you want to watch that. I also got a chance to go on to Inspiring Philosophy and talk about our experience with Alex O'Connor and Jubilee. You can find a link down below for that as well. With that being said, thank you guys so much for your time. God bless and have yourselves a great day.